It was a Tuesday in November. I remember the day specifically because I had been counting weeks since I lost my apartment, and Tuesday marked exactly 6 weeks of sleeping in my car. 6 weeks of waking up with fogged windows and a phone battery at 4% and telling myself today would be different. My whole life had collapsed in the space of about 4 months. A job I had worked myself into the ground for gone. A relationship I had built 3 years around gone. And an apartment I had stretched every last dollar to keep gone. All 3 inside the same season, like the universe decided to collect everything at once. I was 26 years old and I was parking outside a 24-hour gym, so I could use their bathroom in the morning without anyone asking questions. I had $43 in my account and a box of granola bars on my passenger seat, and I had stopped calling my mother because I didn't want her to know how bad it had gotten. That's the thing about hitting rock bottom that nobody who hasn't been there understands. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. It's embarrassing. It's granola bars and a gym bathroom and pretending on the phone that you're just busy. And here is where I need you to pay attention, because this is the moment everything changed, and not gently. I was sitting in that car on a Wednesday morning just 3 days after that 6-week mark. Outside a coffee shop I couldn't afford to go inside. I was using their Wi-Fi from the parking lot to apply for a job I was almost certainly not going to get when a black car pulled in 2 spaces away from me. I didn't look up. I had stopped noticing things that weren't directly relevant to surviving the day. But then there was a knock on my passenger window and I looked up and there was an old man standing outside my car in a coat that cost more than every item I owned combined. I almost didn't roll the window down. Something about him made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't immediately explain. He was tall, even hunched slightly with age. White-haired. Steady eyes. And he was looking at me not like a stranger looks at someone parked in a lot. He was looking at me like someone who had been searching for a specific face and had just found it. He said 4 words before I could say anything at all. "You look like her." And I knew, I don't know how I knew, I just knew that my life had just split into 2 halves. Everything before that window, and everything after. I just had absolutely no idea how dark the after was going to get before it got anywhere close to better. I should have driven away. I want to be honest about that, because looking back, every instinct I had in that moment was telling me to start the engine and pull out of that parking lot and never think about that old man again. But there was something about those 4 words that pinned me to my seat. You look like her. Not a compliment. Not a greeting. A statement of recognition from someone who had clearly been carrying an image in his mind for a very long time, and had just watched it walk into reality. I rolled the window down 2 inches. That's it. 2 inches, because I was 26 and homeless and a stranger had just knocked on my car, and I was not completely without survival instinct. I asked him what he wanted. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me. He didn't flinch at my tone. He just reached into the inside pocket of that coat and held a business card against the gap in the window and waited. He didn't push it through. He just held it there and let me decide. I took it. The card was thick, the kind of heavy cardstock that tells you before you read a single word that whoever had it printed was not concerned about the cost. There was a name, a phone number, and a single line beneath it that identified a private equity firm I had never heard of. I looked up from the card and he was still standing there, patient in a way that felt practiced, like a man who had learned a long time ago that stillness was its own form of power. I asked him who he was, and he said something that I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count since that morning. He said, "I'm the reason your mother never talked about her father." The granola bar I had been eating was still in my hand. I remember that detail specifically because of how absurd the contrast was. Me sitting in a fogged-up car with a granola bar, and this man in his coat telling me in 11 words that he was my grandfather. A grandfather I had been told, in the few conversations my mother ever allowed on the subject, did not want to be found. Here is what I knew about my mother's father before that morning. Almost nothing. She had shut that door so completely and so early in my life that I had stopped knocking on it by the time I was 10. I knew he existed. I knew he had left. I knew that whatever happened between him and my grandmother had been damaging enough that my mother carried the weight of it into every relationship she ever had. That was the complete inventory of information I had been given, and I had accepted it the way you accept weather, as something that simply was with no use in questioning it. And now he was standing outside my car window, and he had found me in a parking lot in a city he did not live in, and he was looking at me with eyes that I suddenly realized with a cold, uncomfortable certainty were shaped almost exactly like mine. That was the moment the fear shifted into something harder to name. Not quite fear anymore. Not curiosity exactly. Something that sat directly between the two and made it impossible to look away from him. I unlocked the door. Not because I trusted him. Not even close. But because somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the $43 and the 6 weeks of surviving alone, there was a question I hadn't known I was carrying my entire life. And this man, whoever he really was, looked like the only person on earth who might actually have the answer. What I didn't know yet was that the answer was going to cost me everything. We didn't talk in the parking lot. He suggested a coffee shop 2 blocks away. Not the one whose Wi-Fi I had been stealing from my car, a different one. And something about the deliberateness of that choice told me he had done some level of preparation before knocking on my window. That should have been my second warning. Instead, I grabbed my jacket from the back seat, shoved the business card into my pocket, and followed a man I had never met in my life into a coffee shop because I had nothing left to lose, and apparently that condition makes you capable of almost anything. He ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted. Black coffee for himself, and for me a latte and a sandwich that I hadn't asked for but consumed in approximately 4 minutes because I was hungry in a way that had stopped being embarrassing and had just become biological. He watched me eat without comment and without the particular expression people get when they're performing generosity and waiting to be thanked for it. He just waited. And when I put the sandwich wrapper down, he folded his hands on the table and he began to talk. His name was Gerald. He was 71 years old. And what he had built over the course of his adult life was not something I had any framework for sitting across from in a coffee shop that morning. He had started with a single commercial property purchase at 28 years old using borrowed money, and had spent the next 4 decades turning that into a private equity portfolio that currently held assets across real estate, logistics, and energy. The number he said with the same flat tone someone else might use to describe the square footage of their apartment was a number I had to actively keep my face neutral about. It was not millions. It was hundreds of millions. And the way he said it confirmed what the business card had already suggested, that he existed in a category of wealth where the number itself had long since stopped meaning anything to him personally. I sat with that information and felt something strange move through me that was not excitement. It was closer to vertigo. But here is the part that mattered more than the money. Here is the part that started pulling at something deep and old inside me. I asked him directly why he had never been in my mother's life, why he had disappeared, why, if he had all of this, he had left a daughter behind and stayed gone for decades. And for the first time since he had knocked on my window, his stillness cracked. Not dramatically, just a fraction. A tension around his jaw that came and went in less than a second, but I caught it. He told me the leaving had not been entirely his choice, that there had been an agreement, that my grandmother, after their marriage collapsed, had constructed a situation in which his continued presence was made legally and personally complicated in ways that had taken years to untangle. He said the word agreement with a particular flatness that told me it was a word he had chosen very carefully to replace another word he wasn't ready to use yet. I didn't push it. Not then. Because I was still processing the fact that this man had clearly known where I was. He had found me in that parking lot specifically, which meant he had been watching or had someone watching and had chosen this moment, this exact lowest point, to make his introduction. I asked him how long he had known where I was. He looked at me steadily and said, "Long enough to know you needed help before you would have asked for it." And just like that, the vertigo turned into something colder. Something that felt uncomfortably close to the realization that I was already several moves into a game I hadn't agreed to play. He didn't make the offer that day in the coffee shop. That's the detail that stayed with me afterward, turning over and over in my mind during the drive back to my car. The drive I took alone because I had insisted on walking back without him, needing the 2 blocks of cold air to think. He had given me information. He had given me coffee and a sandwich and the outline of a history I had never been allowed to access. But he hadn't asked me for anything and he hadn't offered anything concrete, and somehow that restraint unsettled me more than a direct proposition would have. A man who had built hundreds of millions of dollars worth of assets across 4 decades did not knock on a stranger's car window without an endgame. The patience of it was the part one couldn't stop pulling at. He called 3 days later. I had saved the number from the business card, which I told myself was practical and had nothing to do with the fact that I had looked at that card approximately 11 times since our conversation. He spoke the way he did everything, without preamble, without small talk, without the warm-up that most people use to soften what they actually want to say. He told me he had a property, a guest suite in his primary residence, which was a 40-minute drive from where I was currently parked. He told me it was empty. He told me I was welcome to use it while I stabilized with no conditions attached to the offer, and that he would have someone send me the address if I wanted it. No conditions attached. I remember those 3 words specifically because they were the 3 words that should have made me most suspicious and instead were the 3 words that made me say yes. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I did not say yes because I was naive. I said yes because I was exhausted in a way that had gone past physical and had started affecting my ability to think 3 steps ahead the way I normally would. 6 weeks in a car does something to your decision-making that is difficult to explain until you've experienced it. The part of your brain that calculates risk starts losing the argument to the part that just needs a bed and a door that locks. The property was not what I had prepared myself for. I had told myself on the drive over to manage expectations, to treat it as temporary, to stay emotionally detached from whatever I was about to walk into. That intention lasted approximately 30 seconds past the front gate. The house was the kind of structure that doesn't feel real when you're standing in front of it, not because it's showy, but because everything about it communicates a level of permanence and intention that most people only ever see in photographs. The guest suite he had described was larger than the apartment I had lost. It had its own entrance, its own sitting room, windows that looked out over a garden that clearly had dedicated professional attention year-round. I stood in the middle of it with my single bag of belongings and felt something crack open in my chest that I had been keeping sealed for months. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated and more dangerous than gratitude. Something that whispered, "What if this is real?" Gerald showed me around himself. Quiet, efficient, pointing out practical things, where towels were, how the heating worked, where to find the kitchen if I needed it after hours. And it was during that walkthrough, in a hallway lined with framed photographs, that I stopped walking entirely. Because in one of those photographs, half hidden behind a larger frame, was a picture of my mother. Young. Smiling. Standing in a garden I now recognized. She had been here before. And she had never once mentioned it. I didn't say anything about the photograph that night. I stood in that hallway for probably 4 seconds longer than was natural, then kept walking and nodded at something Gerald was saying about the kitchen and filed the image away. In a part of my mind I intended to return to the moment I was alone. My mother. Young, maybe 19 or 20, standing in the garden of a house she had never told me existed, smiling in a way I had rarely seen in any photograph from her adult life. The kind of smile that belongs to someone who doesn't know yet what's coming. I recognized the garden because I had just walked through it 20 minutes earlier. There was no question about the location, which meant there was also no question that my mother had stood on this property, had spent enough time here to be photographed looking comfortable and happy, and had chosen to erase every trace of it from the version of history she handed to me. I lay awake in that guest suite for a long time that first night. The bed was the most comfortable surface I had been horizontal on in 6 weeks, and I could not sleep in it because my mind was moving too fast and in too many directions. I kept returning to the same uncomfortable calculation: how much of what I believed about my family was true, and how much had been carefully edited before it reached me. The first full day in the house introduced me to the staff, 2 of whom lived on the property, and to the rhythm of how Gerald moved through his own space. He was up before 6 every morning. He took calls in his study from early, and the door stayed shut until mid-morning. He ate lunch at the same time every day, and he ate it alone. He was not unfriendly, but he was not warm in the way that fills a room. He was warm in a precise and deliberate way, like someone who had learned to deploy it rather than someone who simply was it. I cataloged all of this the way I catalog things when I don't yet understand a situation, quietly, without drawing attention to the fact that I was doing it. On the 3rd day, I heard the first conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I had come back through the side entrance after walking the grounds, and the study door was open by about 4 inches, which it never was when Gerald was on calls. I wasn't trying to listen, but I was close enough, and the house was quiet enough that 2 sentences reached me before I had time to move away. A male voice I didn't recognize coming through the phone on speaker, saying something about timelines and whether she had been told yet. And Gerald's voice responding with 3 words that stopped my feet on the hardwood floor completely. Not yet. Soon. I moved away from the door and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and breathed. Told myself it could mean anything. Told myself I was pattern matching because I was already unsettled and looking for confirmation of a threat that might not exist. But the thing about being a woman who has survived a sustained period of genuine hardship is that your instincts get calibrated to a very specific frequency. And every instinct I had was now vibrating at the same note. Something was being managed, and I was part of what was being managed. That evening at dinner, Gerald mentioned, with the same casual tone he used for everything, that he had asked his lawyers to prepare some paperwork he wanted to walk me through when I was ready. Nothing urgent, he said. Just something he had been meaning to deal with for a while. He said it the way you'd mention picking up dry cleaning. But his eyes, for just a fraction of a second, were watching me far too carefully for a man describing something routine. The meeting with the lawyers happened on a Thursday morning, 8 days after I had moved into the guest suite. Gerald had mentioned it twice more in the days between that dinner and the actual appointment, each time with the same carefully casual framing, and each time I had nodded and said something non-committal because I was still in the phase of collecting information rather than responding to it. I had also, in those 8 days, done every search I could do on Gerald's name, his company, his history, and anything publicly available that connected him to my mother or my grandmother. What I found confirmed the scale of what he had built. What I didn't find was anything that explained the gap. The decades of silence, the disappeared father, the photograph my mother had never mentioned. The lawyers came to the house. 2 of them, both in that particular register of professional composure that signals significant billable hours. They set up at the dining room table with folders and a laptop, and the specific organized efficiency of people who had prepared thoroughly for a meeting they expected to be emotionally complicated. Gerald sat at the head of the table. I sat across from the lawyers. And for the first 20 minutes they walked me through documents in the measured, jargon-controlled way that legal professionals use when they're trying to make something enormous sound administrative. Then the number came. $9 million. Held in a trust that had been established, and this was the detail that punched the air directly out of my lungs. 23 years ago. I was 26. Which meant this trust had been created when I was 3 years old. Gerald had not decided to do something generous after finding me in a parking lot. This had existed my entire conscious life. Sitting somewhere in a legal structure, accumulating, waiting while I grew up without knowing it existed, while I struggled through my 20s, while I spent 6 weeks sleeping in a car 40 minutes from the house where the paperwork had been filed. I looked at Gerald. He was watching me with that careful steadiness he deployed when he wanted to appear calm and was working at it. I asked him, and I kept my voice level because I needed the answer more than I needed to express what I was feeling, why he hadn't told me sooner. Why, in 8 days of dinners and walkthroughs and careful conversations, he had not mentioned that there was a $9 million trust with my name attached to it. He said he had wanted me to be settled first. He said the information was significant and he hadn't wanted to introduce it while I was still in transition. He said all of this reasonably, and I sat with it and recognized that every word was true and that none of it was the complete answer. The lawyers moved on to the structure of the trust, how it was held, what it was invested in, the projected value over the next decade if left to continue growing. And then the older of the two lawyers clicked to a new page on his laptop, and his tone shifted by approximately half a degree into something more deliberate. He said there were conditions attached to the release of the funds. Standard language in trust structures of this kind, he said. Conditions that had been established at the time the trust was created, and that remained legally binding. He turned the laptop to face me. I read the first condition and it was straightforward. I read the second and felt my stomach tighten. And then I read the third condition, the one at the bottom of the page, the one that had clearly been placed last because whoever wrote it understood that it needed to be seen after the number had already had time to settle in the mind. I read it twice to make sure I had understood it correctly. And then I looked up at Gerald and the expression on his face told me everything. He had known this moment was coming for 23 years. I'm going to tell you what the condition said. But I need you to understand something first because the condition itself is only half of what broke me in that moment. The other half was the architecture of it. The way it had been constructed with enough legal precision that it was clearly not an oversight or a casual addition. Someone had thought about this carefully. Someone had sat with a lawyer 23 years ago and deliberately built a wall inside a door, and then spent 2 decades waiting for me to find it. The third condition stated that full release of the trust required verified proof of a continuous relationship, defined in the document as regular documented contact over a minimum period of 18 months, between myself and my maternal grandfather, Gerald, the man sitting 3 feet away from me at his own dining room table, who had found me in a parking lot 8 days ago after 26 years of complete absence. I put the laptop down on the table very carefully because my hands needed something deliberate to do. The lawyers were quiet. Gerald was quiet. The entire room had the specific stillness of people who have been present for a planned detonation and are now waiting to see the radius of the damage. I asked the question that was sitting at the very front of everything. I asked who had written that condition into the trust. Because Gerald had established the trust. That had been made clear in the first 20 minutes of the meeting. But the conditions, the lawyers explained carefully, had been added as an amendment, filed separately, and filed not by Gerald's legal team, but by a third party with documented power of attorney at the time of the amendment. The third party was my grandmother. I sat with that for a moment that felt much longer than it was. My grandmother, who had raised my mother alone after Gerald left. My grandmother, who had spoken about Gerald exactly twice in my presence, and both times with a finality that closed the subject like a vault. My grandmother, who had died 4 years ago, and who I had grieved without ever having the conversation I had always told myself we would eventually have about the family history she kept sealed. She had known about the trust. She had known about it, and she had inserted herself into its conditions, and she had constructed a clause that made it impossible for me to access the money without first building a relationship with the man she had spent her life keeping at a distance. And she had done all of this without telling my mother, without telling me, and without leaving a single explanation behind when she died. The question of why she had done it was now sitting in the middle of my chest like something with weight. I looked at Gerald and asked him directly whether he had known about the amendment, whether he had known my grandmother had added that condition. And his answer was not what I expected. He said yes. He had known. He had found out approximately 18 months after the amendment was filed, and he had chosen not to contest it legally because And here he paused in a way that was the first genuinely unguarded moment I had seen from him, because he believed she had been right to do it. He believed she had been right. A man who had been absent for decades thought the woman he had left behind had been justified in making his granddaughter earn her own inheritance by building a relationship with him first. And somewhere underneath my anger at the manipulation of it, underneath the shock of discovering that my grandmother had been a far more strategic woman than I had ever understood, was a single devastating question I couldn't yet bring myself to say out loud. Had my grandmother built this condition to punish Gerald, or to protect me from making the same mistake my mother had made in cutting him off entirely? I didn't have the answer, but I was beginning to suspect that getting it was going to require surviving what came next. I didn't tell anyone about the trust immediately. Not because I was strategic about it, I wasn't in a headspace for strategy that week, but because I needed time to sit with the shape of it before I handed it to anyone else to react to. I spent 3 days after that meeting walking the grounds of Gerald's property in the early morning before he was out of his study, turning the condition over in my mind, trying to locate the emotion underneath the shock that would tell me what I actually wanted to do. The money was real. The condition was real. My grandmother's fingerprints were all over a document she had never once mentioned to a living soul. And I was still no closer to understanding the original reason Gerald had been removed from our family's story in the first place. What ended the silence was not my decision. It was a phone call. My mother called on a Sunday evening, and something in my voice during the first 2 minutes of our conversation told her that something had shifted. She had always been perceptive in that specific way, not emotionally available but perceptive, which is a painful combination to grow up around. She pushed and I made the mistake of hesitating instead of deflecting cleanly, and the hesitation was enough. I told her I was staying somewhere more stable. I told her I had been in contact with Gerald. I did not mention the trust. The silence on her end of that call lasted long enough that I checked the screen to confirm the call was still connected. What followed was not the conversation I had prepared for. I had expected anger directed at Gerald. What I got was anger directed at me, cold, controlled, and with an undertone of something that took me a full day afterward to correctly identify as fear. She told me I didn't understand what I was involving myself in. She told me Gerald was not what he presented himself to be. She told me that whatever he had offered me came with a cost she had spent her entire adult life paying down, and that I was making a decision without the information required to make it safely. When I asked her what information, she said she wasn't going to do this on the phone and then ended the call. She didn't call back for 4 days. In that same week, Gerald's son arrived. I hadn't known Gerald had a son from a later relationship until the man walked into the house on a Wednesday afternoon, and the temperature of every interaction in that building changed within the hour. His name was Marcus. He was in his late 30s, polished in a way that looked maintained rather than natural, and he looked at me from the moment of introduction with an expression that was technically pleasant and was doing a significant amount of work to stay that way. Gerald introduced me simply as his granddaughter. Marcus smiled with everything except his eyes and said it was wonderful to finally meet me. The word finally did a lot of lifting in that sentence. By Thursday evening, I had noticed 3 things about Marcus. He was present in parts of the house he had no practical reason to be in. He had at least 2 phone conversations near my end of the building that stopped the moment he registered I was within earshot. And he had asked Gerald, in a tone I was clearly meant to hear, how long I was planning on staying. Gerald had answered that question with a stillness that communicated more than words, the stillness of a man drawing a boundary he intended to hold. But Marcus had nodded with the particular compliance of someone who has decided to find another route to the same destination. I had come into this house with 1 complicated situation. I now had 3. And the trust, the condition, my grandmother's secret amendment, my mother's fear, and Marcus's barely concealed hostility were all pulling toward the same center of gravity. Something was buried at the core of this family, and everyone except me already knew what it was. I started with the photograph in the hallway. It was the oldest unresolved detail I had, the one that had been sitting at the back of everything since my first night in the house, and I had learned over the years that when you don't know where to start pulling, you start with the thread that's been bothering you the longest. I waited until Gerald was in his morning calls and the staff were occupied, and I stood in that hallway with my phone and photographed every framed image on that wall with the methodical attention of someone who understood they might not get a second opportunity to look this carefully. There were 11 photographs. My mother appeared in 4 of them. In the earliest, she looked about 16, standing stiffly beside a younger Gerald in what appeared to be a formal setting. A function of some kind, a dinner, everyone dressed carefully. She was not smiling in this one. In the next 2 she was older, maybe early 20s, and the body language had shifted from stiff to something more complicated. Not comfortable exactly, but present in a way that suggested she had made a decision to be there rather than been placed there. The 4th photograph was the one I had first noticed, the garden image, the smile I didn't recognize, taken last chronologically, which meant the relationship between my mother and Gerald had not been simple absence. It had been a progression that went somewhere before it went silent. My mother had not been kept from Gerald her entire life. She had known him, and something had happened to end it. I spent that afternoon on my laptop constructing a timeline from everything I had gathered, Gerald's public business history, the dates on the photographs as best I could estimate them, what I knew about my grandmother's life, the year the trust had been established, the year the amendment had been filed. What emerged was a sequence with a gap in it that I couldn't fill from public information alone. A 4-year period in my mother's mid-20s where the photographs stopped, where Gerald's company underwent a significant structural change that had been covered briefly in a business publication I found in an archive, and where, I now realized, my mother had moved cities, changed careers, and according to everything I knew about her timeline, met my father. The business restructure was the detail that caught me. I dug into it for 2 hours, and what I found was thin but directional. A dispute settled privately, involving a previous business partner whose name appeared once in the archived article, and then disappeared entirely from any subsequent coverage. Settlements of that kind don't disappear cleanly without significant legal and financial effort. Gerald had clearly applied both. I was sitting with that when Marcus walked into the kitchen. He made himself coffee with the ease of someone fully at home and leaned against the counter and looked at me with that maintained pleasantness and asked how I was settling in. I said fine. He asked if Gerald and I had been spending much time talking, getting to know each other. I said some. He nodded slowly and then said, in a tone calibrated to sound offhand, that he hoped Gerald was being transparent with me about the full picture of the family situation, because in his experience people sometimes edited their own histories in ways that weren't entirely fair to the people hearing them. I looked at him and asked what he meant by the full picture. He smiled and said he just meant that every family had complexity, and he'd hate for me to make significant decisions based on an incomplete version of events. Then he took his coffee and left. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after he walked out, because Marcus had just done something very specific. He had planted a seed of doubt without giving me a single piece of actual information to examine. That's not what someone does when they want you to find the truth. That's what someone does when they want you to feel unstable enough to make a mistake. The question was no longer just what Gerald was hiding. It was what Marcus needed me not to find out. My mother showed up on a Friday. No call ahead, no message, just a car in the driveway that I didn't recognize until I saw her stepping out of it, and realized she had driven 4 hours because whatever she needed to say to me had apparently become impossible to continue not saying. She looked at the house the way you look at something you have spent a long time successfully avoiding and have now been forced to stand in front of, not with surprise because she clearly knew exactly what it looked like, but with the specific exhaustion of someone who had hoped this confrontation would never become necessary. Gerald was out. I hadn't known he was going to be out that morning, and I don't know whether my mother had timed her arrival around that or whether it was coincidence, but the result was that we sat in the kitchen of his house, just the 2 of us, with coffee neither of us was drinking, and she finally opened the door she had kept shut my entire life. The money in that trust had not been accumulated cleanly. That was the first thing she said. And she said it with the flatness of someone delivering a fact they have made peace with, and then unmade peace with repeatedly over many years. Gerald's early growth. The specific period of expansion that had taken him from a single property to a portfolio substantial enough to generate the kind of wealth that eventually became my trust, had been built in partial partnership with her mother, my grandmother, who had come from a family with generational property holdings that she had brought into the partnership during her marriage to Gerald, holdings that had been used as collateral and leverage during the most critical growth period of everything he had built. When the marriage ended, my grandmother had walked away from those assets as part of a settlement that she had signed under circumstances my mother described with a careful neutrality that told me the full version of those circumstances was something she had decided I could only handle in pieces. What my grandmother had walked away from represented, conservatively, a foundational contribution to an empire she received no ongoing recognition or compensation for. She had raised my mother alone on a fraction of what she was arguably owed, and she had done it without public dispute, without legal action, and without telling her daughter the complete truth about why until my mother was old enough that the information had nowhere to go except inward. I sat with the weight of that and felt the $9 million change shape entirely in my mind. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't even guilt money exactly, though guilt was certainly threaded through it. It was something closer to a partial accounting, Gerald's version of acknowledging a debt he had never formally settled, constructed in a way that came to me instead of to my grandmother, arriving too late for the woman it should have reached and too loaded with conditions to feel like anything as simple as restitution. My grandmother had known this. She had known the origin of every dollar in that trust, and she had inserted her amendment anyway. Had insisted that I build a relationship with Gerald before accessing money that was downstream of her own sacrifice. And I finally understood why. She hadn't been punishing Gerald. She hadn't been protecting me from him in any simple sense. She had been making sure that I would know him well enough to decide for myself whether he was a man who deserved the version of forgiveness that comes from being genuinely known rather than simply paid. My mother looked at me across that table and said she was sorry she hadn't told me sooner, that she had believed protecting me from it was the same as protecting me, that she understood now those were not the same thing. Outside the kitchen window, I could see the garden from the photograph, the place where my mother had once smiled in a way I had never seen in her adult life, before she knew what she knew, before the accounting came due. I reached across the table and took her hand, and neither of us said anything for a long time. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a single question had just moved to the front of everything. If Gerald knew that I now understood where the money came from, what was he going to do next? Gerald came home 3 hours after my mother left. I had spent those 3 hours sitting with everything she had told me, turning it over not emotionally but structurally, the way you examine something you need to fully understand before you decide what to do with it. By the time I heard his car in the driveway, I had moved past the part where I needed to process and into the part where I needed answers that only one person in the world could give me. I was sitting in the living room when he walked in, and something in my stillness communicated immediately that the dynamic between us had shifted, because he stopped in the doorway and looked at me with the eyes of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment and had not been able to predict exactly when it would arrive. I told him my mother had been here. I didn't frame it as an accusation. I stated it as the opening coordinate of a conversation we were now going to have completely, without the careful editing and deliberate pacing he had been applying to every interaction since the parking lot. He crossed the room and sat down across from me, and for the first time since I had met him he looked his age. Not diminished, but carrying something visibly, the way people carry things they have held for so long the weight has become structural. I asked him about my grandmother's contribution, about the assets she had brought into the partnership, about the settlement and what she had signed away and under what circumstances. I asked him directly, and I held his gaze, and I did not give him the space to redirect into something more manageable. What followed was the most honest conversation I had with him in the entire time I had known him. Not because he volunteered everything freely, he didn't. But because he had clearly reached a point, whether through age or exhaustion or something else entirely, where the maintenance of a carefully constructed version of events had become more costly than the truth. He confirmed what my mother had told me. He confirmed the contribution, the settlement, the circumstances. He used the word pressure to describe what had been applied to my grandmother during the negotiation, and he said it looking at the floor rather than at me, which was the closest thing to shame I had ever seen move across his face. I asked him why he had built the trust in my name rather than making direct restitution to my grandmother while she was alive. And his answer cracked something open in me that I hadn't been prepared for. He said he had tried. He said he had attempted contact with my grandmother on 3 separate occasions over the years with the intention of some form of settlement, and that she had refused every approach without explanation. That she had returned his communications unopened. That she had, in her own way, made a decision that the debt would not be settled between the two of them directly, and that the trust, established in my name when I was 3 years old, had been his response to a door that had been permanently closed to him. Then he told me something he had not told anyone. He said he had been diagnosed 8 months ago, that the condition was manageable currently but that the trajectory was not indefinite. That finding me in that parking lot had not been coincidental in its timing. He had been looking for the right moment for 2 years, and the urgency of his own timeline had finally overridden his patience. He had found me when he did because he was running out of time to find me at all. I sat across from a 71-year-old man who had done real damage and had spent decades in the particular prison of knowing it, and I felt something move through me that I had not expected to feel in this conversation. Not forgiveness, I wasn't there yet and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but something adjacent to understanding. The recognition that people who cause harm are not always indifferent to it, and that indifference and damage are not the same thing, even when the damage is equally real either way. I asked him one final question before I left the room. I asked him what he wanted from me, not from the trust, not from the condition, but from me personally, from whatever time we had in whatever form this relationship was going to take. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I want you to know me well enough to decide what I'm worth to you. That's all I've ever wanted from the moment I found you." I stood up and walked to my room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Because the man in that living room was complicated and culpable and running out of time. And I was 26 years old with $9 million attached to a condition that was beginning to feel less like a trap and more like my grandmother's final, extraordinary act of wisdom. Tomorrow I had a decision to make. And for the first time since that parking lot, it felt entirely like mine. I want to tell you how this ends. Not because the ending is simple, it isn't, but because you have stayed with me through every layer of this and you deserve the complete version, including the parts that don't resolve the way stories are supposed to resolve when you're telling them to someone who has been hoping the whole way through that everything turns out clean and clear and unambiguous. Doesn't. But what it turns out to be is something I have come to value more than clean. It turns out to be real. I stayed. That was the first decision, and in many ways it contained all the others. Not because of the $9 million, though I want to be honest and say the money was not irrelevant to a woman who had been eating granola bars in a parking lot 3 weeks earlier. I stayed because of what my grandmother had built into that condition, because I had finally understood it not as manipulation but as instruction. She had known Gerald longer and more completely than anyone alive. She had been damaged by him and had chosen, in the most private and deliberate act of her life, not to let that damage be the final word on what he could mean to someone she loved. She had decided that I deserved the chance to find out for myself, and I was not going to refuse the last gift she ever gave me without at least doing the work she had asked me to do. Marcus left the property within 2 weeks of my confrontation with Gerald. I don't know exactly what was said between them, and I didn't ask, because some resolutions don't require your full participation to be complete. What I knew was that Gerald had made a choice about what he was protecting in whatever time he had remaining, and that choice did not include managing Marcus's discomfort with my presence. The maintained pleasantness disappeared from the house along with him, and the air inside those walls changed in a way that was immediately and physically noticeable. My mother came back. Not to the property initially, that took longer, and I am not going to compress that process into something tidier than it was, because watching two people navigate decades of damage in real time is not a linear thing, and it is not my story to fully tell. What I can tell you is that she came back, and that Gerald received her with the same stillness he applied to everything, and that I sat at a dinner table with both of them 6 months after that parking lot and watched something that had been broken for 30 years begin, very carefully and with no guarantees, to be examined by the people who had broken it. The 18 months passed. The trust was released. And I want to tell you what I did with it because I think it matters. I did not spend it on the things you spend money on when you've been without it for a long time and suddenly it arrives. I established a portion of it in a structure that would generate ongoing support for my mother, because the downstream effect of my grandmother's sacrificed assets had landed most heavily on her, and that felt like the most direct correction I could make. The rest I used to build something of my own, slowly and with the particular intentionality of someone who understands that money with a complicated origin requires careful stewardship. Gerald is still here. His condition has progressed in the way his doctors told him it would, and we don't talk around it because he is not a man who responds well to being managed, and I have learned that the most honest thing I can offer him is exactly that. Honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. We have breakfast together on Tuesday and Friday mornings. He drinks black coffee and I ask him questions about his life that nobody else has ever asked him, and he answers them with the unguarded directness of a man who has stopped calculating the cost of being known. I think about my grandmother often. I think about the woman who signed away foundational wealth in a settlement she had no real power to refuse, who raised her daughter alone, who died without ever seeing the accounting corrected, and who spent the final years of her life quietly inserting a clause into a legal document that would require her granddaughter to sit across a breakfast table from the most complicated man in her family, and look at him clearly enough to decide what he was worth. She never told anyone she had done it. She just did it and trusted that eventually I would find my way to understanding why. I found my way. It took a parking lot, a business card, a hallway photograph, 2 lawyers, a dining room table, a confrontation, and the longest 18 months of my life. But I found my way. And if you are somewhere right now that feels like the end of something, if you are in your own version of 6 weeks in a car with $43 and a box of granola bars, I need you to hear this from someone who has been exactly there. The knock on the window that changes everything does not always come in a form you would have chosen. It does not always come from someone uncomplicated or without history or without cost. But it comes. And what you do when you roll down that window is entirely, completely, and without exception yours to decide. That part was always mine. It just took me a while to know it.